The Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back. It's the Misfits. We are on episode 99. We finally figured out what episode we were on. It only took us 99 episodes to figure that out. And so today for episode 99, Brandon is unable to join us. However, Joe Dea from BuddyWalk and Kingdom on the Road, Brother Matthew from Brother Matthew and Kingdom on the Road were able to join us. And they're joining us specifically because of the fact that they could not resist jumping in on the conversation that we're going to have today. If you're watching the video, you may have already figured out what we're going to be talking about. If you're listening to this and you didn't read the title, you'll find out here shortly. So, if you have no idea what has been happening this week in the U.S., there has been a whistleblower that has shown up to Congress to basically tell the world that they have been dealing with what they have been describing as NHIs, or non-humanoid interfaces. I think that was the correct terms. That was the terms that I kept hearing multiple times. And admitted also to otherworldly advanced technologies. Never said the exact words that we all want him to say. But he admitted to all this stuff, and it's caused a big uproar. But basically, the U.S. government has just admitted in a congressional hearing to the public that aliens are real. This has caused, like I said, a massive uproar among the Christian community, because you have claims from some saying that this is all just more persecution and attacking the Christian faith. You've got some yelling about the fact that this is confirmation of demons, not aliens, and the government just doesn't know what they're doing. You've got some going off the eschatological rails again, claiming end times and end of the world and Cloverfield and everything else. You've got claims of more conspiracy theories and that this is all just cover for some other big thing going on. And on and on. Did I miss any good? Did you guys hear any claims from any hot topic claims here?
I think that pretty much squares the circle.
I think that's about it. Yeah.
Just, it's all hogwash.
It's all hogwash. All of those sort of things.
Oh boy, here we go.
What we are going to do today, though, is we're actually going to stop and do this episode that I have been wanting to do for a while, and was supposed to do on 3 other shows, and all of them got moved around and schedules got canceled and everything else. And so we're finally going to sit down and do this. And we're going to look at something called exotheology, which most people, even experienced theologians, have probably not actually heard of. But it is a real thing. I did not make this one up. So exotheology, which is the theology of extraterrestrials, or
that's fantastic.
So, yes, we're probably going to make a lot of stupid sci-fi references. So if you don't like it, get over it. We're doing it anyway. When you've got the 3 of us together and talking about this topic, there's no way it's not going to happen. So, Like we said, exotheology, not well known, not really that well studied for obvious reasons. And most people that might have any idea about it know about it because of the great C.S. Lewis, who was an exotheologian, which, again, most people are going to have no idea that he even was. Or from Rabbi Kaplan, who is a Jewish rabbi who also has been very vocal in that most people that are sci-fi people and theology people have at least heard of, maybe not read, but at least heard of. Had you guys heard of him before I sent you this stuff?
Yeah.
He's very well known within a very select community, which all 3 of us are a part of. So we're going to look at all of this. We're going to look at some of the different viewpoints of exotheology. We're going to look at some of the different responses to what aliens actually would mean for us theologically. And then we're going to hopefully offer encouragement to everybody that's freaking out. So to start with, we have 2 people that are actually more Lewis not inclined, I guess literate than I am, even with Joe and Matt here. Matt has been walking through Mere Christianity for a number of years.
I was,
At least it seems like it's been a number of years. Joe is a Narnia expert in many regards. What see if we can narrow this down. Why is Lewis considered an exotheologian? Because it's in 2 different series that he's written, but let's just start with why is he being brought up in this topic?
I'll go ahead and kick this off. So I think a big part of it is when you look at Lewis and the time period in which he wrote, and a lot of the times when Lewis comes up, he comes up in the same kind of conversation as his contemporaries. A lot of the others wrote grounded fiction, grounded fantasy. He was unafraid to ask bigger questions, to explore what it would mean for our theology if other worlds existed, other civilizations existed, and things like that. And so, on one hand, Lewis kind of wins the award by default in certain ways because he's kind of one of the only voices that jumped out on that ledge and said, okay, let's say what if. But at the same token, he really did not limit the questions that he asked to the most pedestrian sense.
Right.
You look at books like Mere Christianity, you look at his more theological works outside of his fantasy stuff, you can see some of those same themes that are resonant in his theological works transplanted, maybe not exactly, but certainly in concept and spirit in these fantasy epics, whether it's Narnia, the Narniad, or the Space Trilogy.
And the Space Trilogy really hits this exact topic.
Yeah.
Which is why it's called the Space Trilogy.
So this is Andrew.
So there's a group of most people that you ask when you ask about the Space Trilogy, they're going to call it the Ransom Trilogy.
Right.
Yep.
That's I think not the right. I will always be an advocate for calling it the Space Trilogy because calling it the Ransom Trilogy kind of narrows its focus to a point where the books don't actually narrow their focus to that extreme. I think it limits the full scope of what's involved in that trilogy of books, because even though there's only 3 books in the Space Trilogy, Lewis pound for pound does more in those 3 books than he does the entire 7 of the Narniad.
Well, and it gets into, again, and this is, we're about to sound like now we're just a Lewis podcast, but, it gets into the same thing that happens when people that are not quite as informed about Lewis as a theologian, about their complaints and their topics when they start talking about Narnia as well, is that when they look at it from a fiction standpoint, the idea of calling it the Ransom series makes sense because they're just looking at it as we're listening to the character and everything else. Just like when they complain about the ideas of, Aslan and everything else, or even when you get into like the joking things with Tolkien and Lewis, as far as, the talking Jesus line and all that kind of stuff. When you don't actually recognize how much theology is actually packed into these kids' books.
Yeah.
You miss what he's actually trying to do, which in some ways is part of the genius of Lewis, is that he wrote books that everybody can read and enjoy, whether they want to do the theology or not. That was part of his point with Narnia and everything else. But the bigger picture here is the fact that both in Narnia and within the Space Trilogy, he opens us up to this idea of the fact that what does the idea of other worlds And, within Narnia, you've got the idea of the world between worlds and all these other things. What does it all actually tell us about the God that we actually serve?
Do you mind if I jump back in?
Yes.
Okay. So last year, I used to be a part of a show called Systematic Ecology. It's still running. You guys can find it, systematicecology.org.
It's in our resources spot because you represented them for the Obi-Wan series over here also. So you can find it on our website.
So we walked through the year of Lewis, and in that entire year, we covered each one of the pieces of the Narniad. And I had a rotating door of co-hosts for it, but I was on the entirety of the series. And one of the extras that we did, in addition to covering the books, is comparing the Ransom trilogy and the Narniad. And that was where, like, we explained the difference between calling it the Ransom trilogy and calling it the Space trilogy and all of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But one of the big things that came out was comparing the complexity of the universe that's portrayed in the Space trilogy to the creation event that's showcased in Narnia. Mm-hmm. And showing the fact that both stories speak to an acknowledgement of the scope and grandeur of the creation in a way that speaks to the scope and the grandeur of the thing that created it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that, for as much as I am going to turn into the resident wet blanket when we start talking about the science of it all and the facts of it all, I, at this point, am going to be the voice that says, take a page out of Lewis's book. Don't be afraid to ask these kinds of questions and really explore the depth and magnitude of the God that we serve and the God that we worship and all of that kind of stuff. Because even if these are just fantasy novels, from a theological standpoint, both series make reflections to the truth in a way that invites you into learning more about the real thing. And I think when it comes to this topic in particular, I would argue that you don't, like, yes, we've spent the last 10 plus minutes talking about Lewis and all of that kind of stuff, because I challenge anybody to find somebody who did it better. Especially from a Christian standpoint, but I would say from a exploring these concepts standpoint in fantasy form, I'm not sure you find somebody who's done it better than Lewis did it.
Right. In a readable format, I think would be the better way of saying it. Because that's that's what we're going to look at. There's a few other guys that actually call themselves exotheologians that we've had over the past 50, 60 years.
Right.
Their stuff is not going to be as easy to pick up and sit down and knock out in an afternoon as Lewis is. Yep. Lewis, you can do that. You'd have to book it through everything to get it through in an afternoon, but you would be able to do it. The other guys that we've got, one of them is a Lutheran theologian named Ted Peters, who his big thing was actually exactly what you just talked about, was he was just pointing out the reality of there has been throughout church history examples of the church fathers asking the questions that Lewis was answering. Things like, what if God created many worlds? What does that mean for us? Is this something we can actually allow? Is this something we can allow? What does this say about who God is? And it was much more about who is God than it was about what, should we be building bunkers or not? And the fun thing for those of us doing Talking Church history is this is another example of where the church actually was ahead of its time.
Yep.
In having these kind of discussions, even though in a lot of ways today we would say that the church shouldn't be having these discussions, which is why we're having it. Other examples within the Catholic Church, you've got examples as well. I just saw yesterday actually a news report about these two guys who they get in a lot of trouble, and the Vatican just kind of says, yes, they're there. Yes, they are smart. Yes, they're employees. We don't necessarily agree with everything we say. We just let them do their work. Very much of a kind of how Dr. Linville talks about me. This is very much what we got. So you've got Catholic Vatican theologian Corrado Balducci, if I could say it. And he's made a lot of controversial statements surrounding the ideas of extraterrestrial life. You've also got another counterpart with him, Jose Gabriel Funes, who is literally an astronomer that is a part of the Jesuit tradition within Catholicism. He's both a Jesuit monk and an astronomer. And so he is part of a major observatory watching all this stuff. And he has made statements a lot of times as far as the idea of the fact that if we believe that God created intelligent life here and that there's intelligent design, then why are we putting limits on where else God could have done it? Very much of again, what does our belief on extraterrestrial life actually say about what we believe about God? Which is a different way of framing the question than a lot of the people freaking out right now are framing the question.
Mm-hmm.
Because this goes into the Christocentric versus fear-driven. Where is our focus actually at? Are we viewing things in the idea of Christ as creator, or are we viewing things as we've got to be watchful for all of these other things that could come in and destroy our faith? So what this is going to look like, and these are the big questions that come up out of what we just talked about. And, like we said, Lewis addressed a lot of these. These other guys have addressed a lot of these, and we're going to try and knock out these 5 questions also. Some of these are more geared towards my field house. Some of these are more geared towards Joe. Some of these are directly related to why Brother Matthew is on the stream. So the 5 questions we've got. One is, what does this say about creation? What does this say about salvation? What does this say about the Imago Dei? What does this say about inerrancy? What's the deal with the arguments out of silence, which is a whole big thing in general, and we could do a whole episode on, but we're specifically talking about within this topic.
That'd be fun. I'd be down for that.
So the first question is, how do we deal with the idea of extraterrestrial life as it regards to creation? And Joe already kind of started us on this, walking us through the way that Lewis deals with it within Narnia. Creation story, Genesis 1 and 2, does not really mention anything about other life. So how do we deal with this idea if there are other worlds and other inhabited worlds with life on it? What does that actually say about the idea of creation?
I mean, I think the people who struggle with it most are the rigid biblicists, inerrantists. Nothing is true outside the bounds of what the Bible has explained.
No.
Which we all know how I feel about that, but.
For more on that, tune in Friday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern, 9:30.
Yep. Because, right, creation's made, whatever, day 6, like, man is like God's crowning achievement, made in his image to have authority and all of these things. And, like, if there's other intelligent beings out there, suddenly man doesn't matter so much.
Mm-hmm.
And there are those who would never admit it, but they're afraid for man to come off that pedestal.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting also because this is where, we're kind of already are getting into the Imago Dei question related to all of this. The other thing that's interesting with what you're talking about there, as far as the idea of is man still the top dog anymore, is that we also see this reversed with a lot of arguments related to things like colonization theories and everything else regarding theology, of this idea of, well, there's no way that the Egyptian culture was smarter than us today, and so it had to have been aliens at that point.
There we go.
Well, that's you have an entire series on that for a lot of people, unfortunately, it is their it is very much their only exposure to any theoretical concepts around aliens, and they call it ancient alien or ancient astronaut theory.
Yep.
That when you drill down into a lot of the voices from the secular space, and I qualify for this from the secular space because even though they are from the secular space very openly, so these are some of the same things that have permeated through how Christians also conceptualize the idea of aliens. When you get down to the progenitors of this theory, there's a very real through line that you can see with almost all of them. And I'll say almost because I am by no means an expert on ancient astronaut theory. So I can't speak to every single solitary voice that is involved. I can speak to the majors, and the majors are all super, super racist, like super racist when you drill down into it. Because they were not white Europeans, they were not intelligent enough to create these things, create these systems, do these incredible feats, all of that kind of stuff. And one of the prime examples of this is the pyramids. That everybody talks about the pyramids. Everybody talks that's like the cornerstone for ancient astronaut theory. But multiple scientists from the Christian world, from the secular world, from different parts of the world, from different walks of life, like overwhelmingly have showcased, okay, here is a very logical way that they would have had access to, that they have shown to do in other usages that would have made it possible for humans to have created the pyramids,
right,
with zero help from extraordinary sources,
from aliens.
So aliens, but aliens. So I'm already picking up my wet blanket to throw it over the thing, but that's a very real thing that you bring up, Andrew, when you talk about this creation thing, or you talk about the Imago Dei and all of that kind of stuff. That we have to acknowledge that a lot of where this stuff is founded reaches for those kinds of things first, rather than, something as simple as you look at creation, right? And I'm going to hit a slightly different angle than what Brother Matthew hit.
Mm-hmm.
If let's take Genesis. We have the creation account, right? And we are literally walking through Genesis right now over on Kingdom on the Road, and we have this account, and a lot of what we're covering as far as that goes. To quote Brother Matthew, we'll say a concept and say whatever that is, because we don't have specifics, and that's okay. As we explore these things, that doesn't make it fake, that doesn't make it false, that doesn't make it unreliable.
Right.
That just means that we don't have specifics. So let's fast forward, though. Let's go to the gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Right? So many of the same events are recorded from a different perspective and a different vantage point in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there are several points where if you know nothing else about the Bible, somebody grabs this in a soundbite and says, oh, well, this must be fake because this gospel account says this and that gospel account says that. Well, all three of us on this stream are married. We're all probably going to go and talk to our wives about this episode after it's done recording. I'm going to highlight certain things. Matt's going to highlight certain things. Andrew's going to highlight certain things. That doesn't mean that any one of our individual accounts is false. It just means that we have individual accounts. So let's take it back to creation. What if that the creation account that we have in Genesis is only part of the story? What if it is the concept of the mythos of mankind as it pertains to us, not speaking to a different civilization, a different world, a different universe, whatever.
Right.
And you know, before we transition off of that actually into the next question, because that's where the next question goes. You know, the other thing before we leave this here is that, you know, like you said, Matt, the ones that are going to have the most trouble with this question specifically are going to be the hardline young earthers. And typically what you hear with that argument is not just, and this, the reason we're saying it this way is that it's not just if you believe young earth creationism, you're going to have a problem with this. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the ones that actually go around claiming to be young earth creationists will say that if you do not read Genesis 1 through 11 literally, then you've lost sight of the gospel.
Right.
Yep.
But this is where it gets interesting, is that the same ones that will say, well, there can't be aliens because, you know, whatever reason they want to go, it's not in the passage, it's not this, it's not this, typically are also ones that are skeptical on how the buildings were made, or this, and this, and archaeology is false, and it's all a big conspiracy and everything else. But within Genesis 1 through 11, we have God talking to other non-human interfaces, to use the word that Congress is using. We have examples of these non-human interfaces involved with the building of buildings and cities within Genesis 1 through 11. And so this is part of where we run into the problem with a lot of just the general, I guess, ignorant arguments coming out of this discussion, is that when people are so hardlined in one direction, they end up with a discussion like this that is so nuanced and so theoretical. And just in our case, it's a fun conversation. In other people's cases, it's probably more of a headache conversation. There are so many pieces that if you are going to take a hardline state, you are going to end up missing major pieces that will either make or break your argument. And this then transitions with what Joe was just talking about into the idea of what does this mean for salvation? What is the soteriological approach to all of this? Because that's the big picture for anybody that is a believer. This should be the big picture in terms of, if we're going to throw a fit about what these findings are saying, it should be because how does this actually relate to my salvation?
Right. Yeah. You know, the one of the big questions I've always asked about this since the first time you said you wanted to talk about aliens. So, aliens,
which for reference was like almost a year ago was when we started this conversation.
Oh, well over a year ago.
Oh, it was definitely well over a year ago.
We've been wanting to do this for a while, or at least I've been wanting to do this for a while.
We're coming up on the fall, so the chat will have existed for 2 years.
Yeah.
October-ish. Yeah.
think I realized that. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys have put up with me that long. Anyway, so aliens are, if there are aliens, just part of the heavenly host, perhaps the sons of God. They are just they're another creature that is part of creation, and they're just out there because creation is just that big and that magnificent. Or if they are conscious, intelligent, moral beings on the level of man, then there's two options. They never fell, so they're still in a pre-Edenic walk with God, or they fell, and then we get to ask: did Jesus coming here save them also, or was there an alien Jesus?
And that's all you have wanted to do this whole time, is just be able to make that statement on my feet.
Yahtzee, got it.
Yes,
Worked
got it that quickly. So, but the two options you bring up are actually only half of the options, at least that my mind, in reading some of the different exotheological stuff, is able to come up with. So,
yeah, I mean, those are my questions.
right.
There's more.
We've really got, there's at least 4 options here. There may be more, and this is specifically coming out of a Christian viewpoint. The Jewish viewpoint on this from Rabbi Kaplan is completely separate from what we're talking about here. And I want to make sure that that's clear also, that he is not one that's going to hold to these sort of things. Because the question that I actually am asking is, how would aliens impact Jesus' sacrifice?
Mm-hmm.
That's the big question in terms of what we as believers would be asking. So the first one that Matt already brought up would be, aliens are part of just creation. It's out there. It's no different than the stars that we see in the heaven that we have on like day 3, I think. Maybe it's day 2, day 3 in Genesis 1. It's a part of creation. If that's the case, it's a part of fallen creation, because creation is impacted by man's decisions in Genesis 3. That's basic soteriological, and I just lost the word for theology of sin. Starts with an H. I know that much.
Hamartiology?
Dealing with sin and dealing with mankind and dealing with salvation is that mankind's decision impacted the state of creation as a whole. It is no longer how God created it in the beginning. If that's the case, they're just a part of creation, then we have nothing. There's nothing to add to any of it, because creation is redeemed at the cross, and creation is redeemed fully, completely, finally in Revelation with the new heaven and the new earth. Creation is redeemed. That is the easiest one to deal with. Because it's just a straight up, it really makes no difference. Everything stays exactly the same that we've always thought of it. It's just there's another aspect of creation we've got.
Yeah.
The other one that Matt brought up is this idea that aliens are spiritual entities. So they're part of the angelic hosts. They may be angels themselves. They may be demons. They may be another type of spiritual entity that we see within Judeo-Christian mythology, all these other things. It could be something like that. And if that's the case, they're not part of the salvation plan at all.
And they're in the Bible.
Which, if that's the case, again, we don't have to do anything about that. It literally is just, we now understand that. I guess the one place that it would change would be for those that believe that angels do no longer speak to us, that God no longer sends messengers in an angelic form. That would be the place where we would have to start dissecting and having the deeper conversations. That's the one place that's affected. Otherwise, it really does not make that much of a difference for us. Outside of those, where we get into the demonology type of things. So Joe, you were going to say something.
Yeah. that second half, I mean, both come with a warning label, but that second half comes with a warning label. I think there's a world where, I mean, if you look at, so you look at something like the show Supernatural, right?
Mm-hmm.
The show Supernatural almost exclusively, not exclusively, but very close, pulls from Jewish mythology, specifically Jewish mythology. And there's a lot to, when you unpack the different mythological practices, even centered around Christianity. We don't need to go way away from Christian terms to get to some pretty far out stuff. So if you're going down that road of, are these just spiritual beings? Is it that aspect of it? Yes, it is. The idea of spiritual exclusivity is a falsehood when it comes to the Godhead, when it comes to the Trinity, whatever that is, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, we know what it is, but I'm saying in terms of specifics, that is a farce. But we need to make sure that we're not allowing the license to go so far down the rabbit hole of trying to square the circle of making this work with the concept of it being of them being spiritual entities, that we are then betraying what we do have written as truth when it comes to these certain things. We don't need to go off base from truth to have, like, football fields, light years, if you will, worth of space to be able to be able to have very articulate and accurate conversations of what if.
Yeah, and that's nothing that we are saying here in this section, at least. Yeah. We are saying is a theological fact. We are just trying to walk through what the different circumstances actually are. And another point, just because we mentioned it before and we said we weren't probably going to get into him at all, but we just did. The show Supernatural relied a lot on the works of Rabbi Kaplan.
Yeah.
And that I was double checking to make sure that I was remembering right. But I think that's actually one of the first places I actually had heard of him, was the fact that his work was very influential into that show. So yeah, we've come full circle there, where we've brought him back into the conversation. Now, so the idea of aliens as spiritual entities was one of the second options, and that was also what Brother Matthew brought up. But there are two other things that we've got to look at in terms of options within what this means for us when we talk about salvation. One of them would be kind of what we see more with what Lewis deals with, both in the Narniad and in the Space Trilogy, of this idea of the fact that the aliens would potentially have their own salvific path. Mm-hmm. They're created on a world that is not ours. They are interacting with the same God because he is the one and only God, but in a different setting and form, and that they have to make their own choices. You know, this is what we see within the Space Trilogy specifically, is you have some planets that do not, Adam and Eve don't bite.
Yeah.
They stay away. And so the plan of creation stands intact the entire time.
Right.
That is another whole idea, which would mean that God would have to redeem them separately. And again, Lewis is a good place to turn to see what that actually would look like. The whole idea of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is we see the redemption action take place within Narnia.
Yeah.
And it's the same plan that we have, just it's in a different form than what we necessarily would recognize. Most of us recognize it. Tolkien always was mad that it was so easy to recognize. But the idea of the fact that you were able to recognize that a Jesus figure, the son of the one that created everything, that authorized everything, came and died for a rebel. That is the story that we have within The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's what we have within the Gospels. God's Son dies to redeem creation. That would have to happen within each individual world within that kind of concept. The fourth concept is one that is a little bit more controversial just because of the political situation that we are in here in the West. Is this idea that alien contact being an aspect of evangelism. And the reason I said that this becomes more controversial is that it's a reversal of colonization theology, colonization theory, which is very similar to the slaveholder theology stuff that we've talked about on Misfits before. This idea of the fact that these people's only hope is that we assimilate them into Christianity. And specifically into white Christianity is what colonization was about. In this case, it would be the other way around, where the aliens are coming to us, and they're only coming to us for the purpose of we are able to give them the gospel to take back to their own planet.
Yeah.
I would say overall that out of all of these, that is the most ridiculous idea out of everything.
Absolutely.
And can I say something that's a little spicy as far as that goes?
Go for a wet blanket.
In the conversations that I have had about what it would mean for there to be extraterrestrials, what if all of this was real, all of that kind of stuff. Out of all of the different cultures that I interact with, all of the different groups that I interact with, all of the different countries, all of that kind of stuff. The only group that has tried to make an argument that the way it would have to be is an extraterrestrial civilization has the Jesus narrative, but Jesus was a figure on an alien planet, and that they would have to come here to learn more, is the West. That's it. Other groups are like, honestly, the prevailing thought, and it's to different, I'm not going to get into every single flavor, but the predominant mentality outside of the West would be some form of community. This would be another group that if it were out and out Jesus, or if it was some other path that leads to God, that it would be the same idea of the connection and the connective tissue of the Holy Spirit in the kingdom of God, and it would be an extension of community. Now, baked into all of that are a million different rabbit holes that you can go down theologically, and all of that kind of stuff. But the concept being, on this show, part of what I love about coming onto this show, and part of what I love about when the BWC, for those of you that aren't in it, the BuddyWalk community, as folks kind of follow me over here and get to hear me speak over here, they get to hear more of the very direct outlined differences of how the West interprets things and thinks through things and wrestles with things, and where they fall short versus other parts of the world, and being honest about how some of the very direct pitfalls affect how we process these things. And I get to talk about that, because being in this and falling into this in a lot of ways, I didn't realize what I was getting myself into in a lot of regards, but you can't unring the bell. And so just as we process these things, that's something you have to be aware of. And when you specifically as it pertains to how does this affect our salvation, and we're going to go into other aspects that shoot off from this idea of how does this affect our salvation. But there's a difference. There's a very notable difference when you process this question with your focus on us or your focus on God.
And specifically, you know, we're back into what we always are talking about, where we're talking about the difference between Christocentric theology and non-Christocentric theology. And specifically with this one, like you said, this is a very much a Western idea, this idea of, well, everybody's coming to us to get the gospel. You know, we talked about this with Dr. Linville last week when we talked about the difference between Roman and Celtic evangelism. The West, as a culture, is a Roman culture in terms of evangelism. People need to come to us and change their ways and become like us so that they can understand who God is.
Yeah.
But when we do that, oftentimes suddenly God is the white Westerner.
Right.
Rather than, in our case, in this case, the God of the universe and universes.
Yeah.
You know, this is why we started with what we did, where we talk about the fact that the reason why this conversation is a theological conversation is because how we view these different ideas tell us a lot about what our view of who God can be actually is.
Right. And that and it ends up really being a reversal of Imago Dei.
Yes.
When we say that, okay, Christians have to, you know, be this way and look this way, and members of the church are these types of persons, we're limiting the image of God, first of all, to a very specific scope. But whether we're aware of it or not, what that does is we then take that limited image and we cast it back towards God.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly God is in the image of man instead of man being in the image of God.
And that actually goes into what the third thing that this conversation has to bring up is this idea of, well, what is the Imago Dei then? Which, if you want a in-depth discussion that comes up with the idea of we don't have an answer,
yeah, we
can
just
go
did
watch
this.
the 3.5 hour live stream that we did on this within Kingdom on the Road, where we walk through the fact that there are just like we're doing here with aliens, there are all these different theories and theological implications and horrible theologies and amazing theologies and all this stuff built off of this idea of the Imago Dei.
Yeah.
Built off of one verse in Genesis chapter 1. There's all these other things, but that one verse has so much that hinges on it.
Right.
And like you're saying, Matt, when we start putting Imago Dei into the context of the alien conversation, now we have to ask the question, okay, so is the Imago Dei mankind? Which is going to already cause some theological fits within certain people within the world that are going to say, no, Imago Dei is just male. Well, that now opens up a whole new thing with what happens now when we're dealing with extraterrestrials. You're saying that only men are made in the image of God, but now you have other life forms involved, not just women, not just children. So who's actually made in the image of God? If we say it's mankind, okay, so then what does that mean for us if there's an alien invasion? Does that mean that we can destroy them without any fear because we're not destroying the Imago Dei? What does that mean for the salvation talk? What does that mean for all of these different things if we're saying that mankind is what's made in the image of God? Because that also runs into the risk, or are we saying that the image of God is mankind and so God is man?
I think a lot of the arguments around this are just as telling as how people interact with other people groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you get it, you get it. I don't need to go into it's the Misfits that you guys go into this on a regular basis. But one of the key things that we kept coming back to when we covered this on Kingdom on the Road was what if the image of God is has more to do with us having a will, us having agency, and all of that aspect.
Right. Yep.
If that's the case, then that supersedes gender, race, ethnicity,
What planet you're
and
from?
the planet you're from, your universe, you know what I mean? Because then if God created a thing and a thing has a will, then the thing is an image bearer.
Right. It now, and this again is part of why the Imago Dei specifically is tied to both the creation and the salvation discussion. Because if they're image bearers, what does that mean about their salvific state? Mm-hmm. That's something that we need to be concerned with as believers. If they're not image bearers, it doesn't matter. It's just another aspect of creation. You know, this is part of what, again, going back to Lewis, why I love the way he words how he describes the human race within Narnia, is this idea of they are sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. They're not humans. They're not image bearers.
Right.
They
They're
are
sons of Adam and daughters of Eve.
Descendants of Adam and descendants of Eve. And so that is the salvific information that we need to be able to discover what redemption and reconciliation looks like for them. It's different than everybody else within Narnia who is part of a different plan. It's part of why Aslan straight up tells, I don't remember if it's Lucy or who it is, he tells of the idea of, I am known by many names. You have to discover me by the name in your world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's Lucy. Yeah.
Because the salvation plan for sons and daughters of Adam and Eve is what we have in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yep. Right.
That's it. That's the basic salvation idea, is that is where we see the plan take place. And so we know that the name of Jesus is what we need. It is a Christocentric theology.
Right.
That may not be the same if we're saying that potentially extraterrestrial life are image bearers. It may not be the same thing as we have here. It may be the same thing, but the reality is that we know that what does God tell us? He has made it plain. He has made it not, people know who he is. You can see him in creation. You can see him in all these other things. It does not mean that we are the only hope for them. Because again, now we are taking it out of a Christocentric theology or a idea of who God is, and it is now making God in specifically the mankind on this planet's image.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we know from history that when we say that, that really only means that it'll be one specific ethnicity on this planet's image that God is going to be made in. Now, the other argument, and this is where Brother Matthew gets to have fun, is we have we have to deal with the idea of inerrancy and the arguments of silence. Now, inerrancy, I'm gonna start us off by making a very specific statement about the inerrancy claim. If you are using, we have to define what we mean when we say inerrancy. If you're using the Chicago or Nashville statement to define inerrancy, it will not allow for aliens at all. But it also does not allow for many other things, including proper hermeneutics and exegesis. So when we're talking about this to start with, if that is your definition of inerrancy, we already are going to be off your radar in terms of when we talk about what this means theologically.
Right.
The historical view of inerrancy, however...
Right. That the Bible is true. It is inerrant. It is infallible in the ways of faith and salvation and all it speaks to. And then that, that becomes where the conversation is. What is the Bible speaking to? What is it actually saying? What was it actually written to portray as far as its message? And those words were backwards, but I hope you understand what I mean.
You're on the right show for being backwards. So now, and this is where, I don't Dr. Barr is the first one I actually have heard say it, and she said it here. I don't remember if it was her phrase or somebody else's phrase, but this is where she used the idea of, the Bible tells us how to get to heaven, not how the heavens go.
Yep.
Yes. That's fantastic.
That is the historical inerrancy idea.
Yeah.
It is perfect without error in the way that it shows us who God is, that it shows us what God's plan for us is, and what it tells us about mankind and creation in terms of the relationship between the two and the relationship between those two and God. That is what we're dealing with when we talk about inerrancy. And so if that's the case, it's very easy actually to see what inerrancy means in terms of the alien conversation, because the only way that it is affected is in the stuff we already talked about. Because it's just dealing with the Imago Dei, it's dealing with the aspect of creation, it's dealing with salvation. Those are what the Bible speaks to. And so those are the areas that it's going to address this conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. So I actually, I've had an interesting relationship over the last 6-ish years with this whole idea of inerrancy, because I was exposed to Christianity before becoming a Christian. Had myself convinced that I believed it and yada yada yada, but didn't actually. I didn't realize at that time that there were alternative ways of processing this idea of inerrancy. And so when I stepped into my walk through apologetics, that was where it was like a floodgate opened. And this whole idea of, well, does inerrancy mean that there's no mistakes? Does inerrancy mean that it does what it's supposed to do? Does it mean literally it's exactly perfectly correct, or whatever? And I've come to understand that when it comes to this, it becomes easy to pick on the West when it comes to processing this in particular. Now, don't get me wrong. If you guys have never heard me on this show, or haven't heard me on Brother Matthew's show, or haven't heard BuddyWalk with Jesus, nobody would accuse me of being a patriotic dude. I'm just not. I'm not sure you're going to hear a voice. Like, I would contend as one of the most cynical and willing to point out the issues with the United States and the West.
It's part of why I bring you on, is because it makes me look like a moderate. But as I have really, honestly, as I've stepped into pastoral ministry, specifically, but the further I go down this road of processing, how do different people hear this? How do different people understand this? All of that kind of stuff. The more that I've realized when it comes to this topic in particular, there's a lot of people running around who do not understand that there are different ways of processing this idea of inerrancy. That inerrancy does not automatically mean every single fact, every single figure, every single aspect, every single account, every single everything is exactly perfectly correct and happened exactly as it's written to the letter of the law.
Right.
But that is not inerrancy.
There's a difference between truth and accuracy.
Right.
Exactly. Thank you. That's what I'm getting at. And so with this is one of those areas where if you are one of the folks that are listening to this that are open about having these conversations that aren't, I mean, if you're hardlined, obviously we've already spoken to the fact that you need to get off your pedestal and understand that there's different ways of thinking about these different things.
And most likely they've blocked me already anyway. So
right. So, but if you're open to hearing, like, asking those questions of what if, thinking about the big picture, all of that kind of stuff, and this is an area where, like, whoa, what? Then take the time to process those things and ask questions. Well, what does this story about? What does this story tell me about the character of God? What is the purpose and intention of this? What is the purpose and intention of this period of time? Think about how people process the Bible in chunks of time as it relates to the whole story of the biblical canon, because then you can start to process this idea of, okay, all right, cool, savvy. We've got the creation account as it pertains to us. We've got the salvation account as it pertains to us. We've got verifiable historical aspects of the Bible as it pertains to us. What if all of this is meant to be, okay, this is what it's showing us about God as it pertains to us? What happens if some other group has a holy scripture? Who's to say that God didn't do that for another group? Now, mind you, after the break, then I get to crack my knuckles and run wild as far as being the wet blanket of it all. But that doesn't stop us from asking the big picture questions. Dare to imagine, dare to dream. You know what I mean?
Well, and that's what, time-wise, I don't know that we're even going to be breaking at this point, because part of what you just actually led us into the big picture thing is why we're even talking about this.
Alien Jesus.
No.
Alien Jesus.
This is the big thing, because the argument from silence sort of thing is part of what you actually are talking about. Because Matt, I'll let you nerd out for a second. Define for us argument of silence or out of silence is what?
So an argument out of silence is basically like all the time someone will ask a question or they'll pose, a theory or whatever, and the Christian response is, well, the Bible doesn't say that, or the Bible doesn't talk about that. And, we're speaking out of silence, right? Well, this isn't mentioned, so that must not be a thing.
Or they go the other route of this isn't mentioned, so there's no reason it can't be there.
Right.
And that is part of the issue with the argument from silence side of this, is that both sides can argue it. And the reality is that both sides arguing it, both sides would be wrong. Because the bigger picture here is the Bible as a tool for us today and for all time is that it is instructing us on how we should live in relation to our Creator.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so if we are going to be getting bent out of shape of, well, it doesn't say this, and so that means this or that means this, in relation to other creatures, other image bearers, whatever they might be, we've lost the plot already. Because now, again, it's not about how we are relating to God or how our relationship with God allows us to relate to other people. It is just well, God hasn't said I have to interact at all. And so because of that, I'm not going to think about what this actually means for me and my relationship with God. And this is not just related to the alien conversation. We see this in a lot of different places around philosophy, around medicine, around illness, around, even though you can't argue out of silence for this, but people claim you can, around racial reconciliation and immigration, all of these sort of things. The argument from silence is what is used a lot of time to dismiss asking the question. Go ahead, Matt. You're about to explode. Go ahead.
Well, you said something, and it just got my brain just exploding. So these are all what ifs. So I just want people to go down the what if train with me for a second. There's application, I promise. If there are the aliens, all the aliens, if they are image bearers, then we have to ask, well, are they people? And if they are people, then we get to ask, well, are they my neighbor? And if they are my neighbor, then that means we have to love the aliens.
Well, here's the question though. If we're saying they're image bearers, do we even have to ask, are they people?
Unfortunately, we live in a world where we do.
Right, and that's part of the big thing, is that this conversation, when we ask these kind of questions, it illuminates other places within our other theological aspects of things that are not what ifs.
Right.
Because if we have to ask, well, how should we treat these creatures of God, whether they're image bearers or not, how should we treat creation, is a discussion that gets argued and argued and argued in today's world regarding ecological things.
Right.
Are they image bearers? Is the question that has been asked since Luke chapter 10, when the rich man, trying to justify himself, said, well, who is my neighbor? This conversation, even though it's way more fun and hypothetical and what if the entire way through, is an important conversation because of the fact that it allows us to examine other areas of how we view God and how we view ourselves.
Yeah.
That's part of why we're having the discussion. That's the big thing as far as what Joe was saying as far as how he was going to go in after the break, is that it's not, even though the conversation is about aliens, it's not actually about aliens. It's about us and God in creation, us in God's creation.
Right.
That is what this discussion is actually about.
I suppose.
And that's part of what when things ancillary to the main topic come up, it has a way of reflecting and highlighting and showcasing what you feel about the main topic. So one of the last times that I was on the Misfits was when we talked about gun control. And one of the times that I was
actually, that was the last time I was on BuddyWalk.
That was on when. Okay, my bad.
Yeah,
we've been on each other's shows a lot. It's almost like we do ministry together.
You'd think.
Then we've also had conversations about the abortion conversations and all of that kind of stuff, and how all of that is processed. And we've talked about these different versions and aspects in conversations of different versions of multi-ethnic ministry, international ministry, different things like that. And this is, we find ourselves now, as we're talking about exotheology, hitting some of those same exact notes, because this is another thing that has to illuminate the question of, how do you process love God, love others? How do you process what the majors are and what the minors are? How do you process when an image bearer looks nothing like you, does not agree with you, does not have the same anatomy as you, does not have the same skin color as you? Because if you struggle there, if that is a spot where there is turbulence, that will absolutely bleed over into, well, what if the person standing next to you in heaven isn't from the same planet as you?
That's a fun question.
So that gets to the idea of this whole idea of Christocentric theology, and this idea of reflecting the core truth of it all in the different manifestations of that truth, and looking at it from a wide angle lens. Because this is one of those areas where, I've seen Mars Attacks. I've seen Independence Day. I was gonna wear my Star Wars shirt.
Yeah, I was trying to find something and I just couldn't find anything.
And so dude, I understand, like there is a contingent of people that when they process this idea of aliens, it absolutely terrifies them to their core.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two different avenues to process this idea of the impact that this has on us. From a theological standpoint, pay attention. We're not going way off the rails to try and make sense of this whole thing. We're saying the very things that bring together Ministry Misfits, Brother Matthew, Kingdom on the Road, BuddyWalk with Jesus, Love Thy Neighbor, Churchosity, the Dynamic Duo, everybody who makes up our group, our network of ministry professionals, shows, broadcasters that all do this thing together. We're hitting on those very same aspects, just from a different perspective. Just, okay, so what does this mean if the people group that we're talking about is from Mars or from a distant planet? Because here's the thing, right?
Not likely from Mars, but yes.
They're not likely from Mars. No, you're correct. So I'm gonna get nerdy here for a second, if you don't mind.
For a second, you're gonna get nerdy for a second. I think we passed that mark a long time ago.
So every star in the night sky has its own galaxy. The word galaxy is a word that is sometimes misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
We live in the Milky Way. When you look at the night sky, it is, for me, a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, you look at the night sky and you're like, man, that's a vast expanse. And are we really ready to double down on this idea that our Creator did nothing with all of that other space? Are we really ready to say that? On the other hand, part of what has to be acknowledged about all of this is a little thing called the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox dictates, if there were aliens, we would have already had some kind of interaction with said aliens. And that's down to the from a technological standpoint, from a civilization standpoint, and all of that. And a scientist named Fermi came forward and posited this as his theory towards aliens and alien existence. Now you couple that with the idea that most of the popular, you see it, I got it wrong. There it is. Here, the depiction up in the, holy Moses. All right. The depiction up here, that comes from a place. There is most people don't realize that when they talk about grays and they talk about large heads and skinny bodies and the whole 9 yards, that has a creation point. That came from a place. Most people, when they quote that sort of thing, don't realize that that's coming from somewhere. Same thing with a lot of the depictions of interaction between aliens and people and all of that kind of stuff. That a lot of that came from a time where there's a lot of conflating stories and misinformation and a lot of reflections on very real world, very tangible things that people were afraid of, that got these concepts got brought into this idea of abduction and a lot and all of that kind of stuff. So we have to be aware that as we know it, these ideas of alien interaction are very, very solidly based in anywhere from how you want to look at it, from myth to folklore to misinformation to sci-fi and all of that kind of stuff. So there's my big wet blanket moment, that you have a guy coming forward and saying, "Oh, I'm gonna blow the whistle on this whole thing." Well, he's not really saying much of anything that isn't found in an episode of X-Files. Just being honest. You know what I mean? I think the people who want to believe him are running wild with this. The people who want to look at this like it's end times happening want the end times to be happening.
Mm-hmm.
The people that want to use this to be racist and another flavor want to be racist. This is just highlighting what people already want and are giving license to run with it. And so that's why I go back to, and I go on this whole big thing of, yeah, you know what? Is there not zero chance that extraterrestrials exist? Guys, seriously, take a look at the vast expanse of space. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that says that it's an impossibility that aliens exist. Absolutely nothing. And it's okay to say, what if they exist, and keep our eyes on God. This does not betray the thesis statement of the Bible. This does not betray the thesis statement of Jesus. That does not betray the thesis statement of salvation. But what it does is it gives us another opportunity to focus on the things that matter. Okay, I'm done with my soapbox.
Yeah, if you need to sum that down, what he just said and that you need to take away is that BuddyWalk with Jesus' official position is that X-Files is a documentary. Now, the bigger thing, though, that he actually did say is, the last two questions that we're going to answer here as we start closing down. One of them is, why should we be
Shut this down, please? Someone put it out of its misery.
Why should we actually be concerned about all of this? And that's what he just talked about, is that this conversation is of concern to us as believers, because it tells us about what we think about God and what we think about what God has asked us to do. It highlights a lot of these different things. It should be of concern to us. We just spent an hour and 15 minutes diving through why this conversation is, 1, fun, 2, nuanced, and 3, matters. Because it's not actually about the aliens. It's about what the theology actually shows us about ourselves, about our beliefs, about our churches, about our missiology, about all of these different things. That's what it shows us. But the other question is why we should not be concerned about all of this. And this is much more related to the fear-mongering reaction to Congress. Joe has already laid it out, but we're going to just go back over it quick. One of them is the fact that aliens don't actually contradict anything within a Christocentric understanding of theology or hermeneutics or scripture or creation or anything else. The idea that other life is out there is not a contradiction to anything we have that matters. Because if it is a contradiction to something that you think matters, that either shows how much of a limited idea you have of who God is or what God's power is, or it shows such how highly of an opinion you have about mankind. This is one of the things when we get into the debates with, those that are so hard-nosed about the idea of it has to be young earth creationism. What does God tell Job? Where were you when I laid the foundations? You were not there. Nobody but him was there. So why do we think we get to determine where he laid foundations and where he did not? To suggest that we can is to take, once again, put ourselves in the place of God. If we believe that God is omnipotent and omniscient and is omnipresent, then the ideas of other worlds with life on it that matters to God is not an impossibility. It's actually a pretty high probability if we want to get philosophical about it. There is nothing that contradicts scripture or theology or hermeneutics or anything that the church teaches or the gospel as a whole with the idea that other life exists. So we don't have to be concerned.
It just expands it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Why we also don't have to be concerned is that when we show concern about these things, it shows us, again, what we already said, misplaced idolatry, misplaced theology, because it's definitely not Christocentric, and it also shows the fragility of the faith that you actually have.
Mm-hmm.
If something as simple as a guy going and saying non-humanoid interface in Congress is enough to make you feel like your faith is about to be destroyed, we need to have a different discipleship level conversation together.
Yeah.
Because there is so much more involved there, because that also is where when suddenly the newest archaeological find comes out that says, oh, well, maybe the city of Jericho was over here and not over here, threatens the gospel for you. We've got to have the conversation. You know, this is part of what I think we said this on Kingdom on the Road. Maybe I said it with Dr. Linville. But, you know, the thing that we forget about when we talk about creation and we talk about apologetics is that Hebrews 11 already tells us what the level of apologetics we actually need to defend creation actually is. Because it is by faith that we understand that God created everything. It is not by the latest archaeological finds or the latest science textbook or anything else. It is by faith that we do this. And that is how God has intended it. Because if it is by faith, then it is only by his power that we understand anything is happening.
Real quick, if you're coming over from BuddyWalk, what he is not doing is not betraying everything that we've talked about blind faith. He's not advocating blind faith. Just so you are aware, that's not the point of all of this. It's a matter of everything that we've already talked about over there about how evidence is evidence, and it still takes an act of faith, regardless of the mountain of evidence that really does exist.
Yes,
that would corroborate the Bible. Anyway,
and it's not blind either. Because again, if we're talking Christocentric theology, our faith is built out of the fact that we have a relationship with our Creator.
Yeah, just clarifying. That's all.
Right. Well, right. And it's a good thing to clarify. But it's also another aspect of what we're talking about here. Is that if we actually have a relationship with our Creator and have experienced the way that He is working on us and working in the world around us, our faith is not blind.
Right.
The fruit of our work and the fruit of the Spirit and the gifting of the Spirit is enough evidence for us to know that what He has told us will come to pass.
Right. The faith is the evidence of things not seen.
And that is the other reason why this is of no concern in terms of anxiety to us, whether aliens exist or not, because Christ is still on his throne.
Yes. Amen.
Everything he has said will come to pass, will come to pass.
Yep.
We do not have to be fearful of this, whether it's because of our faith or because of our physical being that we are afraid of losing. That is why we do not have to be concerned about what is going on in Congress at any time, but especially when we're talking about as it relates to aliens. So this was one that we've been wanting to do for fun. We've also been wanting to do for theological reasons, and especially in light of everything else, you're like, now's the time to do it. So
now it's pertinent. It's pertinent to do it now.
It's always pertinent, but especially today. So real quick, though, before we go, Brother Matthew, where can people find you?
It'd be Brother Matthew, it's brothermatthew.net. I almost forgot my own website there for a second.
And you've taken a break, but when are you coming back?
Brother Matthew right now is kind of on a break until the fall-ish. Got a lot of life stuff going on, so that might get pushed back to the spring, but should be the fall. You can find me most every Friday on Kingdom on the Road as part of that panel, right down there where we all appear from time to time.
Every
And,
once in a while, we get beamed in.
Yeah, but at BroMatMin on all the socials, as well as YouTube, I have a back catalog of all kinds of stuff. So,
And Joe, give us the rundown of all 1,015 projects that you've got going on here. I've got only 2 of them ready to go, but list all of them for us.
Okay, so you can find me anywhere that you find podcasts, as well as on the YouTubes. If you look up BuddyWalk with Jesus, we are walking through the Matthew series, getting ready to bring that in for a landing that has been almost an entire year in the book of Matthew. And then we have some YouTube exclusive podcasts on the channel. As Matt said, 9:30 Eastern, 8:30 Central, 7:30 Mountain, 6:30 Pacific. You can find us along with Anthony Wilson of Love Thy Neighbor on there. We're currently working our way through the Old Testament, trying to demystify the Old Testament. We just wrapped up the mythos of mankind. Thank you again to these two for creating that title for that episode. That was fantastic.
Mhm.
And for outside of the Christian theology world and all of that. Actually, before I jump out, I also am working on with Heath Brady of the Churchosity podcast, a show called The Dynamic Duo. We are 2 pastors from different generations discussing life, discussing how life affects us as pastors and how that affects us as Christians. And for those that are looking for something that is more in the entertainment world, I host a YouTube channel called Shell Shocked. That is a Ninja Turtles themed show that you can check out over on the YouTubes as well.
And now some of those things that they mentioned are in production at the moment. Some of them are out. Some of them have been out for a while. So if you want to find all those different things, you're just going to need to stay tuned to their guest portals on the website where we're going to update it as it goes. You also need to stay updated with all the Misfits stuff, which you can do on the website, and even sign up for the email newsletter that we're hoping to actually try and do here in the next couple of weeks. As the
fun.
yet to be named network continues to be formed, and we get links and everything ready for that. So if you want to stay tuned, up to date with all of that stuff, again, their guest portals is one place to go, but then also just stay tuned for all the information about the network and things like that. Or just jump on the Kingdom on the Road live stream, and then you'll be able to stay updated with all of us all at once. So the other big announcement is that because we finally figured out what episode number we were on, next week is episode 100. Woo, yay! Fireworks, boom, boom, boom. So Brandon will be back. We don't know exactly what we're going to be discussing yet. We don't know exactly how we want to do up episode 100. But next week is episode 100, so you're not going to want to miss that. And like I said, Brandon will be back for that. Again, you also can sign up to get all of the different stuff we're doing over on the Misfits site and sign up for the new email newsletter. And you'll be able to get all the information on upcoming stuff, including things that are going on with Patreon. So again, if you want to join Patreon, patreon.com/Mr. Misfits. All the different levels will get you access to different stuff, starting at the $3 level, which gets you access to the blogs and the Bible studies, and even exclusive behind the scenes invitations for different stuff. You can also join us over there to get access to some exclusive episodes, including an upcoming one with Pastor Joel going over mental health and gun violence. We've got some stuff on politics and media and things like that with Christian Taylor and Joe Ash Thomas, all that good stuff. Get some Misfits merch, all the good things. So patreon.com/Mr. Misfits. Again, next week, episode 100. This was episode 99. We finally got to talk aliens. So thank you, Brother Matthew. Thank you, Joe Dea, who got beamed out of here a little bit early. But in the meantime, we will talk to the rest of you next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.